I'm going to try to go from Marconi to GPS and a little beyond and do that in about 35 minutes. So right away we have a problem. So you notice the next caveat is short and expurgated. And I bear full responsibility for that. And you'll also see along the way that as I dug into this, I found some things I thought were interesting that had little to do with radio navigation. So I'm going to present them to you anyway because I'm the speaker. And so in there, however, there's one little quiz because there's something that happened. I'm going to ask the audience for your opinion on whether the actions taken by a certain person were okay. And I'm not going to tip my hand much more at that point. My focus is on the United States because if you expand it to German, British, Russian, and French, you quickly see the whole task is absolutely impossible. Now let me see if I have the clicker working. Oh, there's a magic button.
Actually, there is a magic clicker, but I'm not sure where it went.
Well, isn't this it?
Yes, it is, but it's the thing that, here we go.
Ah. Great, thank you very much. Okay, here's the outline. RF pioneers, and this goes back to a gentleman you may have heard of named Maxwell and then Marconi. Some definitions of radio navigation and the like. And then I'm going to go with a modest digression into Jimmy Doolittle, who did some interesting things. Early systems, the first worldwide system, the second worldwide system. Does anyone know what that was? It was Omega. The third worldwide system, and a few observations. Okay, theoretical basis. Maxwell, James Maxwell, lived a very short life, and in that time he did some absolutely astonishing things. He discovered equations that govern the propagation of electromagnetic waves, and at the time, there was no practical use for this that anyone could really see. The physicists were fascinated by it, and they tried to apply it mostly initially to light rather than radio waves, but of course the phenomenon is the same. I would offer for your consideration this book, and you notice there is a name circled there. I don't know if you know who that gentleman is, but he is my esteemed colleague at Stanford and was the PI on Gravity Probe B, Francis Everett. And he wrote one of the defining histories of Maxwell. As a matter of fact, I am authorized to offer you copies for $15 each, signed by the author, right over here, should you want them. But it is a great history and referenced in the Encyclopedia Britannica, by the way. That gives it a lot of credibility. Here are the equations, and honestly, I don't recognize the left-hand column of them. I vaguely recognize the right-hand column, and as I recall, I was once given quizzes on this. Do not give me a quiz right now, because I'm not quite ready for that. But at any rate, the theory really explained the first transatlantic radio transmission by Guglielmo Marconi, but it was probably not understood what was going on at the time. And I say this since that's what Marconi said himself. The Italian inventor and engineer Guglielmo Marconi. Thank you, Internet and Google, because if you go on the Internet, you can find an actual statue to him, and you use Google Street View, and here it is at Le Mans and 16th, and that's the good Mr. Marconi. So he was an experimentalist. He acknowledged that. He was an engineer in our current parlance. He had the first patent in England in 1896. Although he was Italian, he felt that England was a more fertile place for such use of communications because England was the major naval power. and he perceived that contact with ships to which you could not send a wire was a very important application. So he really should be known for developing the first effective system of radio communication, and he proved that in 1901 by actually having a transmission across the Atlantic. He probably did not realize why he could sometimes receive and sometimes not. Because later, apparently, people studied what he had done and said it was clearly impossible. The frequency band he was using should not have made it. But then again, they ignored the reflections from the ionosphere. And it is now apparent that, well, I don't know if it's apparent, but it's at least suggested that the ionosphere was the reason he actually was able to receive it. I thought that was kind of interesting. His invention was initially deployed on ships, very logically. And how many people have read Thunderstruck? It's a very interesting story about catching a fleeing murderer, and the underlying technology that allowed that to happen was Marconi's, a true story by the way, Marconi's invention. It was also the enabler for the rapid rescue of the Titanic victims. And dimly in my memory as I went through this, I thought, yeah, I think I remember some of the details. It was on the 14th of April, 1912, and he proposed some other uses that I'm going to show you. Now, I tried to see if there was some connection between Google and Guglielmo, but the history does not support that idea. Okay, now we have in our audience, and this is the reason I have some trepidation, because we have in our audience a gentleman by the name of Mark Raboy, and he is the author of a book, Marconi, the Man Who Networked the World, and it's just come out. I confess I'm only halfway through it. I got it on Kindle, but he's right over here. Raise your hand. And my guess is that if you really want a copy of that book, he would be willing to sell it to you. Incidentally, I bought one first thing because I contacted him last night and said I very much would like to have one. All right. Well, fast forward slightly. Marconi won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1909, but he shared it with this man. And the reason Ferdinand Braun also received it is not because he invented the CRT, but he became interested in wireless technology early on. And when Marconi did his first experiment, apparently it was simply a spark gap that was fed directly into an antenna. And incidentally, these sparks were so huge that you almost had to have earmuffs if you were anywhere in the vicinity. And right away, those of you who understand a little bit about energy balance, you say, where did all the energy go? Well, it did not go into a single frequency. It went into a whole bunch of them. And the result was the only filtering of the frequency was a result of the connection to the antennas. Very, very inefficient. But Braun solved the problem. And he learned how to actually transmit and take the power specifically at a certain band of frequencies. And as a result, the Nobel Committee understood that it was indeed Braun's discovery that enabled the experimentalist to correctly, or to be able to carry out that first transatlantic transmission. So in 1909, they indeed awarded that, and it ultimately led to a whole industry. And that's one of the things Marconi is famous for. He was an entrepreneur, and he did very, very well at that. And they were, again, jointly awarded the Nobel Prize for their pioneering developments. Here's a few samples, just to give you a little idea what it looks like. Here was an early apparatus, and he's demonstrating it. Apparently, there was a paper tape recorder that he used to verify that indeed he had received or sent something. And that's on the left there. But now let's talk about his foresight, because in 1901, very early on, he commented that he had built largely on the work of others, and he particularly named Maxwell, Lord Kelvin, Professor Henry, and Professor Hertz. Does anyone see any commonality in the names that I have in red? Every one of them has a basic physical unit named for them. These were the giants. We stand on their shoulders. Well, this is interesting. In 1922, he said it should be possible to design apparatus by means of which a ship could radiate or project a divergent beam of these rays in any desired direction, which rays, if coming across a metallic object, such as another steamer or ship, would be reflected back, thereby immediately realizing the presence of a ship. So by 1922, he had anticipated radar, which I find very, very interesting, and it shows the creative juices that he had running in him. Now, I'm going to now get into the mystery, or the question I have. You are the jury, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Titanic. The Titanic, if you recall, came across an iceberg, ripped a hole in the side. Evidently, the Titanic was not built as well as it should have been. The watertight compartments did not hold. The bulkheads gave. And within a little over 2 hours, it sank. And I think this was the night of the 14th and then the early morning hours of the 15th of April. But Marconi's experiment to the rescue, he sent out a distress call. And it was actually received apparently by 12 ships. There's only 10 of them on this picture here. But this ship here, the Californian, where are we? All right, the Californian, I don't know why it was named that, but was absolutely the closest ship. It did not go to the rescue. And I'd like to walk down, now I'm on a digression, of course. I would like to walk down why it didn't go to the rescue. Before I do, I'm hoping, SOS? No, that is not what they used back then. Marconi devised this particular distress signal, and I suspect the CQ says, shut up, stop transmitting. And I don't know if that in Italian means something, but we have an Italian person, maybe the abbreviation. But if you add a D, it is, be quiet, I have a big problem. And apparently the CQD was the actual transmission that was made from the Titanic. So the question is, should Californian have gone to the assistance? So I want you to all think about it. We're going to take a quick vote as I run through some factoids here. The Californian, this is the ship that didn't go to the rescue, sent a message to the Titanic at 7 o'clock at night and said, there's a terrible ice field. We're in the middle of some very bad stuff. Nearly collided. Captain Stanley Lord, who was the captain of the Californian, said, I'm not moving. I'm just going to sit here and ride it out because I'm scared to death. Too dangerous to proceed. He spotted the Titanic's lights about 5 miles away. The Californian radioed the Titanic again. He said, stopped and surrounded by ice. The radio signal was so strong, they were so close, that it actually jammed or went into the Titanic's regular communication, and Titanic said, shut up. I'm busy. The Californian then had a very important action. They shut down the transmitter at 11:30. 10 minutes later, the Titanic struck the iceberg. The Californian was sighted from the Titanic's bridge. They said, oh, the Californian's over there, and they spotted him 25 minutes later and started shooting off rockets. The officers aboard the Californian had spotted this and called down to Captain Lord and said, what should we do? He'd gone to bed. And Lord suggested California contact Titanic via a Morris lamp. A Morris lamp is flashing light in which I don't know if it's still used in the Navy, but when I was a young midshipman, we certainly used it. And he did not wake up the wireless operator, suggesting the rockets were simply company signals. The officers believed there might be something more serious. At 2 in the morning, the statement was, Titanic appeared to be leaving the area after firing a total of 8 of these rockets. That sounds like more than company signaling to me. The Titanic sank roughly 2.5 hours after it got struck. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the Californian sighted rockets coming from the south. On that diagram, the Carpathia was due south, and apparently as soon as it heard this, it immediately changed course and went as fast as it could towards the Titanic. At 4:15 in the morning, a shift change, and the new wireless operator came on board and said, well, why were those rockets fired? At 5:30, Captain Lord was now awake, and he suggested that they go to the Titanic's position, but they didn't go directly. They kind of did a twisting, longer route. And by the time the Californian got there, all survivors had already been picked up. Carpathia left for New York. The California stayed behind. So how many think that the Californian captain had a bit of a problem? How many think the Californian, because of fear of the icebergs themselves, was justified in not going to the rescue? Well, it turns out you are absolutely correct in terms of the two inquiries that were given. They placed blame on Lord, and this was a big hoorah in the papers back then. However, there was an irony. The Californian, very shortly thereafter, was torpedoed in 1915 during World War I, and its fate was never discovered. So, that was digression A. Now let me go on to show you some other artifacts of Marconi's background in life that have a bearing on the history of radio navigation. This is in Sestri, Levante. I pronounced that bad. Where's my Italian friend? I'm sorry about that. But at any rate, there is a place in Italy that has a very narrow approach harbor. And because this was a particularly narrow channel, it was a great place to put on a demonstration of a new tracking system. And here's how the tracking system looked. It had two antennas at different frequencies. On board, this is actually Marconi's ship. He was a great sailor, Elettra. He had a two-band receiver. And what he did, he invited a bunch of experts. He put the curtains down on the pilot house and proceeded to steer from this device. And he got right straight in the channel, very, very dazzling. So he had the first step, but he didn't apparently pursue it. And then again, I will let my author friend here tell me if I'm dead wrong, but I could not find any reference to further effort that he had undertaken. There is one issue that's raised here, and pilots, Andy Barrow, you'll understand what I'm saying. A fly to versus a fly from needle. In this case, I've drawn this as what we call a fly to. In other words, the needle is telling you which way to go, not which side you're on. You understand the distinction? It turns out in pilot circles, when I was at the test pilot school, this was a big question. And the trouble is, if you didn't have uniformity in that, you tended to get confused on which side you were on. So, at any rate, fly to versus fly from, I've assumed that that was the way it was. A few definitions. Radio determination. Two major categories. The one on the left, location, which is radar and that sort of thing, I'm not talking about at all. On the right, I am sampling radio navigation, and there are three general techniques: measuring distances by timing, measuring direction with directional antennas, and then another technique that was actually used with a certain system that I will describe, velocity, looking at Doppler shifts and ascribing to that certain characteristics of where you are. And if you delve deeper into what a radio navigation system is all about, bearing measurement, radio direction finding. And in this case, the user is determining the relative position of something relative to him or her. The beam steering is different. In that, the user can determine which sector he is in or which beam he is in relative to the transmitter itself. And these are two distinct things, both of which were pursued in the history of radio navigation. Of course, transponders, we call them distance measuring equipment, which are used today. Hyperbolic, the example is Loran, and another system that some of you may not know of called Omega. Generally a master pulse, a secondary pulse coming from a couple of other places. You measure the time delay, and you have hyperbolas. You recall hyperbola is the locus of points such that the distance between two foci is a constant, or there's a constant delay. And then pseudo-range. And I distinguish between GPS and hyperbolic because GPS has a common time base across all transmitters. And that's at least slightly different. Okay, let's talk a little bit about radio direction finding, a device for finding the bearing to a radio source. Hertz discovered that radios had directionality, and this shows an early apparatus on the right. It was a major area of research. The Army Air Corps in 1931 developed a prototype, and if you had two measurements and could reference them to your own compass so that you could get the two bearings, you could figure out where you were. So unfortunately, the receiving antennas tended to be proportional, at least to some degree, with wavelength. And this suggested that they go to higher frequencies, but of course that would lead to shorter ranges. Initially mechanically rotated, but today, as you know, they are automated. And you automate a phase array and you can figure out all AM stations, for example, where they are. Now, I'd like to turn to James Doolittle. Everyone knows what Doolittle was famous for in the United States in April of 1942. And that was flying a bunch of bombers off an aircraft carrier that was in the vicinity of Japan and carrying out a raid which was less than 6 months after Pearl Harbor. It was a response to show, hey, we're not done yet. You did not knock us out. And so it was a great lift for the United States. But this gentleman, if you dig into his history, is absolutely an amazing guy. First of all, he went to Cal. That's perhaps not quite as amazing. But he did go to MIT in 1924. In 1927, he was the first to perform an outside loop. And now an outside loop, if you're not a pilot, is where instead of pulling this way, in which you have positive G's, if you're sitting here in the airplane, you go around this way. And you get negative G's. And then you get what is called red out. It's not a very comfortable thing, and American pilots don't generally like to do that. In 1932, he set the world's high-speed record. He won the Thompson Trophy, and I'm going to give you a little snapshot of what this meant because, another air race, what does it mean? It meant a lot back then. And he won it in this airplane, the GBR-1. Now look at that airplane. If you're an airplane driver, this little thing back here is a vertical stabilizer, and this little thing here is the horizontal. That plane, Doolittle, who was an accomplished test pilot, said that was the most dangerous plane he'd ever flown. And you look at that just for about 3 seconds. That is not an exaggerated picture. It's all engine. So he won the Thompson Trophy in this. And if you, I'm not going to go into the details, but if you read his tactics in this race, it was astounding, and he effectively lapped the field. So it wasn't even close. He got a PhD in aeroastro, the first one ever awarded in the United States. And in 1929, he became the first pilot, and this, now I'm getting back to the real thread, first pilot to take off, fly, and land in an airplane using instruments alone, and you see this little dome here. We'll see it a little closer in just a minute. So what's that? What am I showing? Let me give you a hint. You see all these little squirrely things here? Those are automobiles. And this is an airfield, and that is the kind of attraction that a Thompson Trophy race had in 1932. Absolutely amazing. I stumbled across that, and I had to share that one with you too. But absolutely amazing. But let's get back to the main theme here, blind flying, sponsored by the U.S. Army. Here's Jimmy Doolittle, and I think if you look closely, you can see the hood that he flips over. And here's his instrument panel. He had a new, very precise altimeter. He had a directional gyro that you initially slaved to your mag compass. And the reason you did that is the mag compass had a history. If you went into turns or things like that, the mag compass is not terribly stable. The DG was. So it was a much more precise way to deal with things. He also had an artificial horizon. So under the hood, he could figure out how much pitch he had in. It also had a radio range and marker beacon that was developed by the Bureau of Standards. But most importantly, it had a very special radio receiver. And that's it right down here in the corner, developed by Radio Frequency Labs. And here's the device a little closer. And you notice this is a fly from. The longest of those two reeds indicates the side you're on. So it's not telling you where to go, it's telling you where you are. So right away you can see there is this bimodal way of displaying this. And this says longest read shows the side off course. So in this case, you're off course to the right. And this became known as the low frequency radio range. There's a lot of other names. I'm going to talk some more about it. But it was the main navigation system used for aircraft for instrument flying until we came across something called the VOR. I'll talk about that in just a second. The initial version had these two reeds, and they were reacting to the had natural frequencies that were reacting to the natural modulation of the two beams, and as a result, the one that would vibrate the more, it was in essence an amplitude detector. Now, another controversy. In the male pilots who had to do a lot of flying across these air routes, they had flown both oral systems that I'm going to describe in a minute, i.e. what we call A's and N's in your ear, and they have flown this, which is the visual type. The male pilots strongly preferred this, and the reason was it was absolutely annoying to keep listening to all that sound in the whole direction you went, and U.S. government in its great knowledge said, no, we're not doing it that way. We're not going to do it this way, which was preferred by the male pilots. Instead, the audio signals became the standard. And this gives you a quick look at it. On one side, you hear N, which is dot it, dot it, dot it. The other is A, da-da, da-da, da-da. And if you time them just right, obviously, when you're right at the intersection of those two sides, you just hear a continuous sound. You can sense that sitting there listening to this drone for hours at a time was not a pleasant experience. But nonetheless, that's what it was. We tend to call this now the Adcock range. The testing was complete by 1928, and they very rapidly started setting these things up. And this just gives you an idea. Here's where the transmitter is. If you're on the A side, so anywhere in here you hear A, but you can't tell whether you're going that way or this way. You've got to sort that out a little differently. So it doesn't solve the whole problem. But once you get actually on the intersection, you know you're on the intersection. You still have to work out a little bit whether you're going or coming, or whether you've actually gone beyond. And so you're going, but you're going still in the direction you want. Did that make sense? Okay. Well, at any rate, so there were a few challenges. It is called the Adcock radio range. So I was trying to show a lot of pictures. I tried to find Frank Adcock. Could not find him. So he's an invisible guy, but he was with the British Army in 1913. We call this sometimes four-course, AN, etc. At its peak, there were 400 of them. Fairly powerful, up to 1,500 watts. The four quadrants, by shaping the antennas, they didn't have to necessarily be at right angles. You could adjust them so they lined up with another beacon that was perhaps over the horizon. The limitation was the course lines were affected by water, snow. There was only 4 dimensions. I told you the pilots got rather sick of listening to them. The quadrants sometimes skipped, and this is perhaps the most important problem. Storms and static could make it almost useless. So the very time that you really want it, when you're in the middle of a storm, it could be interfered with. So there was a problem. This shows an actual aeronautical chart, and it illustrates the fact that they need not be at right angles. For example, this angle here is 80 degrees. This angle here is 100, and oh, by the way, the north sector was always N. So you did at least have that going for you. So they tried to make it better. And they came up with a 12-course radio range system. And this shows it. And this is the display now, and it's got a bunch of colors and reads, a very similar technique. And so I decided, well, I was going to discover how this all worked and then explain it to you. Well, I got into looking at all these various colors and combinations, and finally I said, okay, it's complicated. And you can imagine in the stress of flying in a storm that you suddenly have to figure out which of those reeds is vibrating and how much. So although this was demonstrated, somehow it never went anywhere. Now, I said I wasn't going to talk about other countries, but I did want to mention this one particular example from Germany. It was called the Lorenz system, and it was really bright. It was done very, very well. It was, at the time, they called this ultra short wave. That's supposed to get a chuckle because that doesn't look very short to us anymore. It had 3 feeds, left, right, and center. So what happened is you kept short-circuiting the left or the right with a pattern that told you if I was to the left, I got dots. If I was to the right, I got dashes. So it had similarities to the AN system, but it was something different. But the reason it was innovative, the reason it was very creative, was they could get, in essence, 1/3 of a degree beam width. And with those frequencies, you couldn't do that unless you had a huge dish antenna. But this technique, in essence, gave them that. They also had marker beacons because as you're coming in, you may be on the beam, but you want to know how far out you got to go in terms of when you've got to start to actually flare, etc. First installed in Tempelhof, and like many of our systems, it led to a number of German bombing aids in World War II. Now, the other technique that was described in the initial definitions was non-directional beacons. Non-directional beacon doesn't have any direction. It is simply a transmitter. And what that does is throw the complexity into the airplane or ship, because now I have to have some technique for determining in which direction the maximum power is. And so from the early 1930s, the low frequency was augmented with these NDFs, and of course any AM transmitter could automatically become a non-directional beacon. More complex equipment on the airplane, of course, costs more, so there was a trade-off. But in a short period of time, most airplanes had both types. Switch gears again. Now let's talk about hyperbolic systems. How am I doing on time? Got to get moving here. Loran, Decca, and G. It turns out these are all in the same generic class. There's a central master station, at least 2 slaves. The master gives a pulse. The user receives it. The slaves receive it as well. With a fixed delay, they transmit a pulse or a continuous signal. Initially, although when we think of Loran, we think of pulsed, it turns out initially it was continuous wave. Now, if you're a surveyor using GPS, all of a sudden you say, oops, lane ambiguity. Which cycle am I on? And that was exactly the problem they had to resolve. This was a gentleman that first proposed it, Bob Dippy. He was a Brit. He worked at a radar laboratory at an Air Force base, a Royal Air Force base. He later, it turns out, was an advisor on Loran A. And this just gives a little diagram of the way it works. Master, a couple of slaves, 2 lines of position. The first one based on the time difference here, adjusted for the fixed delay that you were aware of. And the second line of position there, and that positions you right there. And in the old days, when I was a midshipman, you had nautical charts that actually had the hyperbolic lines measured as the time delay. So if you went to your CRT and got that time delay, you were able to actually use the chart itself the way it existed. The United States Army Air Corps picked this up, went to a relatively high frequency, But the delta time measurements were a pain, and I remember as a midshipman doing this. You had a CRT, and you had to keep changing the scale and matching these pulses, and then you read all these numbers off. A far cry from GPS or even the modern Loran in terms of what you had to do. The first chain, 1942. By the end of 43, there were around 12 over the North Atlantic. One caution, Loran, especially Loran today, has a definite phase lag. You can't just take the prediction of distance based on the speed of light or the speed of radio waves because the Earth's surface distorts it. Over salt water, quite uniform. Over land, not so uniform. And weather can affect that propagation time, particularly for users that are a little further away. Now let's turn to the mainstay of navigation in the United States for quite a long time, since certainly after World War II. And that is a system called VHF omnidirectional range. It's very high frequency. It was developed in the United States, 37 deployed in 46. It has become the worldwide aviation standard. It is interchangeable in general. But the thing to note here is by 2000 there were lots of them around the world, about 1,000 in the United States, and now we find ourselves, I don't know what the number is today, we've got, I know Karen's here, maybe somebody could tell me what it is, but about 900 are left, and the reason is it is being replaced by GPS. This is a typical display or a chart that shows a VOR station, and it's frequently co-located with something called DME, and it's very similar to a military system called TACAN, Tactical Aid to Navigation. Their accuracy, about 0.6 of a mile at 100 miles. That's the accuracy. If you go into the international standards, they'll say don't trust it to that much. Make that number there about a degree. So it's a larger number apparently just for conservative purposes. DME. DME is simply the aircraft sends out a series of pulses. There's a beacon on the ground. It sends pulses back. And after a certain time delay, typically 50 microseconds, that pair of pulses comes back. Once the user thinks he's locked up, he starts to send it very rapidly, 30 interrogations per second. And the accuracy suggested that I read at any rate was 1/10 of a nautical mile. Obviously, it's saturable. If you have a single beacon that's trying to respond to lots of airplanes, it might have a little problem. And the military version of that, called TACAN, the major difference is it goes up in frequency by a factor of 3 or 4. And as a result, it is more accurate. The bearing at least 3 times better than VOR. And then there are combined systems with military and civil. The way it tends to look is like this, with the distances measured in nautical miles and a little dial to tell you which direction it is. There is a similar system used exclusively, similar in a radio sense, that's exclusively used for landing, and that's called a localizer, which means azimuth, and glide slope. It was first tested in 1929, and by 1945 there were 9 of these systems, and it's fly-to needles in the cockpit, and it is still the dominant commercial landing systems, although I will say a bit more about that in a minute. So now let's shift gears. Let's start to look at satellites. The basic idea of using artificial satellites for terrestrial navigation began because of Sputnik in 1957. There were a lot of failures and successes in launches. If you recall, the United States finally launched a satellite in 1958. But these 2 gentlemen were watching Sputnik, Geyer and Wiefenbach at the Applied Physics Lab, and they noticed that as the satellite crossed, it had a Doppler signature that would shift. It's like a train going by you. It starts out and you hear the high frequency of whatever is making noise as it goes by. And so they said, wow, we can listen to that signal and we can tell at the inflection point exactly when we're perpendicular to it. And if we knew where the satellite was, we would have an indication of where we were in one dimension. Oh, but wait a minute. If it's real close, that is very sharp, and if they're a long way away, it's very slow. So I can also determine range. And they did it. And this, after they had figured this out, Frank McClure said, let's turn it around. Instead of we figuring out where the satellite is, let's have our receivers figuring out where we are, and that led to a system called Transit, the Navy's Transit. Eventually it had a bird cage of satellites developed under this gentleman on the left. I don't know who that guy is on the right. The purpose was updating submarine inertial navigation systems. Again, a military flavor comes into this. Again, it was Doppler. Those orbits went around every 107 minutes. So you did not get continuous capability. A satellite was kind of interesting. It was gravity gradient stabilized. Aeroastro guys know what I'm talking about, and gals. But it requires a gradient of gravity that's significant, and the extra weight down there tends to point down or up. It turns out it only works when you're close to the ground, or fairly close to the Earth. Launched on a scout out of Point Mugu, as I recall. A couple of frequencies, which were the pioneering technique that was used by GPS. We have to give it a little credit there. Orbit determination and prediction was 12 hours ahead. We also have to give a shout out to Transit, who started the orbit determination and prediction stuff. We used that, but we had to modify it heavily because we needed it quicker. Fix available every few hours, about 25 meters if you're not moving, and if you were moving, you better know how fast and in which direction because you were interfering with the Doppler's ability to figure out where that crossing was. And by 1964, some felt an improved system could be developed. Here's Transit. Its operation ceased at about the time the GPS was declared fully operational. The other system, the second worldwide system, was Omega. It is very similar to Loran with one notable exception. It was hyperbolic, but it was worldwide. How did they achieve that? They went to a radio frequency so low, you could actually hear the tone if it were pumped through a speaker. 10 to 14 kilohertz with huge antennas. And I'm certain this isn't even a quarter wave, probably a tenth of a wave. I don't know, one of my radio friends can figure that out. But 12 to 14 foot high, and there were only 8 of them in the whole world. One pulse every 10 seconds, and the accuracy was 3 to 6 miles. But good enough for submarines, because a lot of that low frequency RF actually penetrated salt water far enough. So it was again driven by the military, managed by the Coast Guard. Oops, and there was one last point I wanted to make. All stations ceased Omega transmission September of 1997. Same reason. Replaced by GPS. So we now get to GPS. You're going to see the fastest history in GPS you've ever seen. We had some competition. I got a decision in December of 1973. And the first launch is shown here. A lot of credit to Gaylord Green. He's around here somewhere. He led the satellite program. Initial operational capability was 21 years and 4 months later. It was like somebody had reached maturity. They could drink now at 21 years or something. At any rate, great credit to this man. Yvonne Getting, the president of aerospace, he had the vision there ought to be a better way. So in 1960, he got the Air Force, or 1964, he got the Air Force to sponsor this study. It is a system study of all the possible ways to navigate from space. And these were the 2 gentlemen that did it, brilliant systems engineers, Jim Woodford, Hiroyoshi Nakamura. I think they're both dead now, but nonetheless, they did a lot of spade work in terms of what was possible. They didn't tell how the system would be implemented. It was conceptual. It was originally classified secret. It wasn't declassified until 1979, long after we launched the first satellite and had broadcast to the world what we were going to do. So, the security, well, I'm not going to get into that. The most fundamental thing, here we've got Jim Spilker, was the sped spectrum CDMA signal. And we also have Irwin Jacobs, who was a commercial developer of CDMA, and thank you, because you probably drove the costs down for us. But the advantages to us was it was easily encrypted. You could use digital sampling, and 1-bit sampling was within 3 dB of optimal. It had something called processing gain, because unlike a comm system, we always knew what the sequence was. So we could take advantage of that and collapse that spreading down to something as narrow as our local oscillator phase noise. So we were able to do that. There are lots of ways to get further jam resistance, aiding with inertials, etc. And our so-called Lonely Halls meeting in the Pentagon, the design meeting that I led, we picked this as the preferred implementation, and frankly, it was a fundamental and very important decision. We got a lot of help from Jim in designing this signal. Went ahead, and it turns out the Air Force hated it. They always were trying to cancel it until along came the Gulf War. And suddenly, armed forces had to navigate in a featureless desert. And suddenly, they got it. They figured out that this system really was important. And I'm told now that virtually every weapon systems in the armed forces depends in some way on GPS. So deployment, lots of applications. And I'd like to show one. Shout out to Andy Barrow and Dave Powell, who was his advisor, but Andy was the one that really did this with a couple of wonderful Stanford students. This is a pathway in the sky generated by GPS. And all of a sudden, you're no longer on those needles. You don't think about anything like that. Instead, you have a series of geometric figures that you simply fly through. And you can do that under a canopy. And it turns out when you do that, even compared to an experienced pilot, the errors drop to 1/3 of what they would otherwise have been, because you're doing something totally intuitive. And it's the 3-dimensional continuous nav with updates of 20 hertz or more that allows you to do that. At any rate, I thought that was a great example. FAA. When I first proposed GPS, the director of FAA stood up in a public meeting, and so he's asked about GPS. This was like 1977. He says, GPS, I don't want it, I don't need it, and if it's ever there, I will never use it. Well, I had some young majors who got really excited about that, and they said, you got to go out and say something. I said, no, we don't say anything. What we do is show them what we can do, and over time, they'll come around. And that turns out is what happened. And the neat thing now is there are over 3,000 WAAS approaches to airports in the United States. I don't know what the exact number is today. Oh, this is pretty current. Okay, and the important thing here is, I told you about the instrument landing system. 1,000 of those airports don't even have that. So this is totally new capability. Here's another example that I'll just throw out. This is 4D navigation into San Francisco Airport. This is a 747 coming in. I got this from the chief United test pilot. And the point is you start your letdown way out, and instead of doing this staged letdown in which you have to spool up your engines, hold altitude, then drop again, this is a continuum. And it is 4-dimensional because it is also timed. And the result is you, in essence, put your engines in idle somewhere way out in the ocean, and you're saving a lot of petrol. It's better safety, less delays, smaller fuel and carbon. And his claim, I didn't know this, his claim was the average fuel savings was that. It's almost an unbelievable number to me. But he said it, and he's the guy. So PNT is going to explode, lots of opportunities. GPS, we're going to have, instead of just one signal, we're going to have 4 at 2 new frequencies. GLONASS has seen the light. They're going to use CDMA. And 4 new civil signals at 2 new frequencies. Galileo is coming along. We have some representatives from that community here. 4 new civil signals at 2 frequencies. Beidou is coming along. We want them to be a little more open in what they're doing, but I think that's coming along too. And Japan. So we're going to have 10 signals instead of 1 or possibly 2. New international signals included. The result, better accuracy, availability, and integrity. I can't leave without talking about eLORAN as a potential backup to GPS. It's a more powerful signal. It's 2-dimensional. Look it up on the internet. It's been pending a decision for at least 8 years. Somehow the government, this would cost less than 1 satellite to deploy. And they don't want to put it in as a backup. I love GPS, but I'd like to see a backup. It's a little different than the old LORAN because all of the stations are commonly synchronized in a way that GPS is. So although it's still technically hyperbolic, it is sort of moving in the direction of something different. So, my last slide. Obviously, I have hurried through a rich and varied and enormous history. Marconi was an early conceptualizer. I've got to hand it to him. He saw ahead some things that really were mysterious to everyone else. The U.S. contributions, the non-U.S. contributions are significant, but most international systems are based on what we did in this country. But having said that, a lot of the underlying concepts in technology started somewhere else, particularly with the British. The largest investor in radio navigation, research and development has been the military. Certainly GPS, transit, no exceptions. And then my get off the stage statement. Everyone knows PTA, right? Protect, toughen, and augment. So GPS is great, but we still need to ensure that it's there when we need it. Thank you.